We all think that prospect shortstop John Gil can be a really good player, but what if I told you he could potentially be a star? I've got some industry experts to talk about it. So welcome on in to Braves Today for Tuesday, February 24th, your source for news, notes, and updates on your Atlanta Braves. I'm your host, Lindsay Crosby, award-winning baseball writer and podcaster. You can follow me on social media at Crosby Baseball. You can find all my written work, bravestoday.com. That's the Braves Today Substack, as this is both a podcast and a newsletter. And I'm really excited to bring you another Substack newsletter that I've been reading for a couple years now, Down on the Farm. I've got Maxfield Lane and Owen Riley, the brains behind the operation. We've talked about their work before. We talked about lineups and how to structure on base versus power in a lineup. That research came from these guys. We talked about building a farm system with positional versatility, like going for up the middle bats versus a third base when you try to make a shortstop, and international free agency, how you should go for volume. A lot of that stuff came from these guys. And so we're just going to have them on the show to kind of give their own insights, because you guys have a really interesting projection model, and it has a lot of really cool outcome-based grading for prospects, and it's really high on shortstop John Gil specifically. What about him makes him a potential star in Major League Baseball?
Yeah. So yeah, thanks for having us, Lindsay, and thanks for all those kind words. Yeah. So, I mean, looking at Gil, he's a guy that ticks a lot of the boxes that I think our model emphasizes that maybe don't get emphasized in other places. So the big thing for him is he's got a really good hit tool and he avoids striking out. And that's something that our model sees as really important. And we've done some other research around this as well. But the big reason for that is because strikeout rate is the stickiest tool that prospects can have, right? So I think we often think about it like home runs, walks, strikeouts, right? 3 true outcomes. These are all equally sticky and equally predictive. But when you really dive into it, home run power can come later for prospects, as they're getting older and they're developing. Being able to make good contact frequently and avoid striking out is something that, obviously hard work and maturing as a hitter gets you some progress there, but a lot of that is really unchangeable as guys are climbing the level. So a guy like Gil, who's demonstrated a really good strikeout rate as a teenager, he only struck out 13.9% of the time in single A as a 19-year-old, right? So he's playing against much older competition, and he's still more than holding his own in that regard. That's something that our model sees as really exciting. And the fact that he was able to do that with not great power, but the home runs were there, right? 7 home runs in 100 games for a teenager, not the worst thing in the world. He walked at a decent rate, 12.3% walk rate. There's not really any red flags that I see with him. And the big green flag is the fact that this is clearly a guy with a good hit tool. And that's the biggest foundational block for a serious prospect going forward.
Yeah. And on the kind of, I'm going to call it a StatCast style graphic that you guys made, where it has some of the different stats and outcomes and everything, it talks about the chances of him being a contributor, a regular, and a star. And it's like 74% contributor, 73% regular, and 24% star. For a guy that isn't in any of the top 100 prospect lists, and typically doesn't even get into the top 5 of a lot of Braves prospect lists, what about him? Is it the certainty that he's going to be able to hit as he rises, or what about him gets him to the projection of he's more likely than not going to be an MLB regular, barring some sort of obvious catastrophic injury or anything?
Yeah. And I'll turn it over to you, Max, in a second, because I know you might want to add some stuff as well. But I think, a big floor for him is the fact that he seems like a guy he's playing a lot of shortstop, right?
Yeah.
And so whether or not he ends up being a full-time shortstop in the show, what we found with these guys, and you referenced it about your, prioritizing guys up the middle, is shortstops tend to be guys who add defensive value, even if they don't end up sticking at shortstop, right? So a lot of the good second basemen, the good defensive third baseman, they come from being a shortstop. And so the fact that he's being competitive there shows that he's got that defensive value, which gives him a good floor. And then you add to that the hit tool that I've already talked about. And I don't know, Max, if you want to go on from there as well.
No, exactly. And I think part of the reason why we don't see him on top 100 lists is because, just looking broadly, Owen talked about the 3 true outcomes. Those are the things that tend to get eyeballs. Those are the things that tend to get hype. But contact and avoiding strikeouts isn't something that we see quite as much, hitting on with the mainstream. I know, Jacob Wilson was a guy who we had rated in our top 10 from the inception of our model, who a lot of people, they ranked him highly, obviously, but they had him in that like 50 to 25 range just because, they didn't think that contact was enough to kill him. Another guy that didn't have the big, home run power going into the show was Dalen Lyle. He was another player that we were super high on because of his combination of contact skills, but also hitting extra base hits. So he was still able to find power. And I think to see a guy like John Gil, who has average gap power, good contact, isn't striking out, and is playing shortstop, that's a foundation where if he adds that strength, that power comes, those doubles come. He's a guy that all of a sudden now is playing shortstop at a high level and is hitting for power, right? There are other players who getting a 30% K rate down in single A down to, I don't know, the low 20s where you can feel okay with them being a good contact hitter. That's a long mission. But for a guy to add strength going from a teenager to in their 20s, that's something that we see quite frequently. So I think that explains why maybe we're higher on him than the consensus.
And I do think the Boston player development system has kind of shown, especially with their bat speed training, that you can take a contact-oriented hitter and you can help develop the power outside of just the natural physical maturation these guys do. And the more that I get to thinking about and spending time looking at prospects, the more I think that's maybe the safer route to build a well-rounded hitter, is to take a good contact guy and improve the quality of the contact versus trying to take somebody who has massive power already, but whiffs a lot. I know you guys talked about Spencer Jones on the social media account just recently about it's, to your point, Max, it's a lot harder to bring down the huge whiff rate or the huge strikeout rate than it is to just get slightly better quality of contact if they're already hitting a lot. So I think that's a great thing there. And hearing that the defense helps is definitely something. Speaking of the defense, though, you guys mentioned that there's still some hope for Nacho Alvarez. And I think I kind of need a little bit of help with this, simply because as Braves fans, we've seen him play a lot of shortstop, and the organization has clearly decided that he's no longer a shortstop. Yeah. And so he's now in this position of, and that was to the point I made earlier, they tried to convert him from a college third baseman to a shortstop. It didn't work out. So he's in a situation where he plays a lot of third base, and he's a decent defender there, but he doesn't have the typical power for third. Maybe he can learn second, but it's hard sometimes for somebody like me to see the outcome. But you guys believe that there is still plenty of development left here for Nacho, and he can be maybe a major league contributor or regular.
Yeah, so Nacho was a guy that we were very high on. He entered our top 20 at various points over the last couple years, prior heading into the 2025 season. The big reason why is that his profile in the minor leagues was incredibly well-rounded, right? Where one thing that Owen mentioned earlier, how important walks are. Walks are especially important in those upper levels of the minors, right? In the DSL, rookie ball, single A, and even high A, guys are walking people pretty often. You could stand there and be a rather passive hitter and end up with a 10% plus walk rate, just by the product of the pitches that you're facing. Alvarez was able to improve his as he went up. He had a 13.9% walk rate in 2025 in AAA, which was solid, small amount of plate appearances. But in 2024, again, 13.4%. Right. So he had the walk numbers to complement his solid contact, which for us was a big, major plus. If you're able to do those two things, you're going to be a guy that's going to be able to get on base consistently. In the show, we've seen that walk rate really crater. Last year, 208 plate appearances, the walk rate was only 5.8%. And there really wasn't a lot more chase there. That was the other thing. He wasn't missing more. He wasn't chasing more. Right. He's just, the quality of contact that he was making was somewhat poor. And you see that in the StatCast numbers with Alvarez, that the quality of contact isn't quite there. But the big caveat that we have is he's still so young. Even though we've seen him play really for parts of 2 seasons already, he's going to be entering his age 23 season. He's a super young 23. He's younger than JJ Weatherholt. He's younger than Travis Bazzana. So, he has a lot left in the tank, right? He's a guy that even though we've seen him, even though we've started to get fatigued that, this guy, we think that he may be the complete product, his age indicates that he's got some runway left. So if he wants to, add strength, be more patient, figure out ways to do that, he's at an age where that's still something that's absolutely possible.
And just to add really quickly on him as well, in AAA in 2024, right, which feels like ages ago now, but really, I mean, there's only 1 season between then and now. He had 10 home runs in 64 games, right? So this is a guy that when he's clicking, it's not like he's incapable of hitting the ball over the fence, right? There's some potential for power there. And I think that's something that for a guy who's going into this year at 23 is something that you shouldn't quite give up on yet. I mean, who knows, right? I mean, maybe we're going to look back in a year and this is going to look foolish, but we still hold out some hope.
And I do think there is something to some of the power numbers that he, I guess, didn't show last year in major leagues because he went down in spring training with a wrist injury and then had an oblique strain in June. So it's safe to assume he probably wasn't playing at full strength. And we've seen from Sean Murphy, from Ozzie Albies, different guys, how the wrist injuries, the oblique injuries can impact your performance for the rest of that season. So I do think it's a great point that you make, Max, that it's just he's so incredibly young. And we've seen this with a lot of Braves guys now. AJ Smith-Shawver was another guy that everybody kind of assumed he wasn't going to work out because they had seen him in parts of multiple seasons, but he's still incredibly young. Nacho doesn't turn 23 until mid-April, which I don't think I quite realized exactly how young he was until you said that, Max. So thank you for that. In just a minute, I want to find out a little bit more about what classifies a guy, a contributor and a star and all of that, as well as maybe hear about a guy that the model didn't quite appreciate at the time. We'll talk about that next, right here on Braves Today. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends at Fantrax. If you play fantasy baseball, this is absolutely the app for you. Fantrax is by far the most detailed, customizable, and deep fantasy baseball app out there. If you just want to make a lineup and let it notify you if you forget to update your lineup for who's not playing that day, you can do that. But if you want all of the other options as well, if you want the deepest player pool in the game, if you want a ton of very specific scoring options or roster settings or other very specialized settings for your league, Fantrax can help you there too. It's Fantrax with an X.com, Fantrax.com/Braves today to sign up for free for a fantasy baseball league. Fantrax with an X.com/Braves today. Welcome back to Braves Today. Lindsay Crosby joined by Owen Riley and Maxfield Lane of Down on the Farm Substack. It's honestly one of my favorite newsletters, downonthefarm.substack.com. Been subscribed for multiple years now. Great original research. It's not only prospect specific, as I mentioned at the top, a lot of other topics as well. Okay, so for John Gil, you guys have, again, 74% odds of a contributor, 73% as a regular, 24% as a star. For those who aren't subscribers yet to the Substack, they're going to join. What's the delineation between contributor and regular and star? Is it playing time? Is it WAR? Kind of what decides that?
Yeah, so it's based on peak WAR per season. So when you're looking at a contributor, we'll start with the bottom. You're looking at a guy who we're defining as somebody who in their peak is averaging 0.5 WAR per season in Major League Baseball. And that may not seem like much, but when you're talking about prospects, right, the vast majority of prospects are not making any impact in MLB at all. And a lot of them come up for a cup of coffee, don't have a chance to accumulate that much WAR or even have a 3-year peak at all. So that's basically telling you this is a guy who is going to at least come up to the major leagues, get some playing time, and be a value add to even if it's a small degree, a value add.
And for context there for Braves fans, last year, and this is Baseball Reference WAR, not Fangraphs WAR, sorry, but Eli White, 0.7 WAR, Nacho Alvarez was actually 0.8. So both those guys added value. They weren't making or breaking the season as far as outcomes, but they were positive contributors at the major league level. So, all right, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. That's a great way to contextualize it. And then so regular would be 1.5 WAR per season, at least in a peak. And then star is at least 3 WAR per season in a peak. And those numbers might seem slightly low, but if you go through, and we use F WAR, but it'll be roughly the same if you look at B WAR with some small differences. When you're talking about that star level, that's a level that only about 1.5 guys per team on average are producing, right? Like it's deceptively difficult to consistently put up that kind of WAR number. And even for the 1.5 WAR per season in your peak, that's only, like 2/3 of starting lineups on average, right? So we're kind of trying to say for regular, this is a guy who is good enough to be really competitive on any major league team. And for star, we're saying this is a guy who, whatever team he's on, he's going to be one of the most productive players on that team.
Yeah. And I think in essence, a 1 in 4 chance for John Gil is probably a lot higher than a lot of Braves fans would have assumed, just given how low he is in the system. And, I think it was 10 games maybe in AA last year, skipping high A completely there at the end of the season. When you look at what he did in that small sample, and I'm not trying to go into all the stats and everything on that on high A, but is that something where it's kind of to be expected for an incredibly young prospect making an age to level jump that significant to struggle? If he had, I guess what I'm trying to ask is the sample size here. Does that, can you really get any sort of insights from what he did in that small sample? I'm sure the model factors it in, but should we be worried or excited or anything about a 1 week sample on a 2-level jump like that?
Yeah, I think that honestly, probably not. I think that, that sample size is so small. You hit 2 home runs and you're a god, and you strike out 10 times and you're horrible, right? So, but what that says to me is that they let him do that. Yeah. Right. You don't let guys that you don't think, you don't let your 20th overall prospect with your team do something like that. You just don't see that. So for us, it shows, if anything, that the team is at least confident enough to say, hey, we think this guy can learn from this. And I think that says a lot about him as a player, and also as, the soft stuff. He's a guy that won't get discouraged. He's a guy that'll take that time and learn from it. I'd expect him to start this season still not in AA. I'd expect him to probably start in high A. But for us, it shows confidence, and it doesn't factor in our model, but to see a team be confident about a player like that is good.
And also, Max, it does actually indirectly factor in the model, right? Because the model will see that, of his 107 games, he spent 6 of them in AA. Yeah. And even though he didn't do well, the model is going to see that he spent a little bit of time at a higher level, and that bumps up the percentages a little bit. So yeah, wholeheartedly agree.
Yeah. I think a lot of Braves fans are hopeful on this one, and I think you guys are going to give a little bit of good context there about they should be able to work out. Somebody that worked out kind of maybe despite what the model said here, and and I appreciate you guys being willing to kind of talk about a miss there. Yeah. Drake Baldwin won Rookie of the Year, and a lot of Braves fans were impressed by his combination of power, hard hitability, but also lack of whiff, lack of chase, and things like that. But the model didn't actually really fully appreciate him as a prospect. Is that more of a function of catchers can add so much value outside of the stats, or is that just the offensive profile of what he did in the minors maybe didn't show that it was going to immediately translate as well as it did to the majors?
I think it's a little bit. I feel like we do a pretty solid job of valuing catchers the way that they should be valued. That's something that I know Owen wrote on, how overall a lot of the other outlets tend to undervalue these catchers. They miss a lot on guys, especially defensive forward guys, where Baldwin is a more offensive catcher. I think for us, it was more how quickly his rise came. In 2024 in AA, spent a little under half the season in AA, a little over half in AAA. In that AA stretch, he wasn't that great. He had a WRC of 104 as a 23-year-old, only hit 4 home runs. The ISO was under 100. So, and he was only walking 9.2% of the time. that's a profile that says, okay, this guy was walking before, maybe he won't do it in the upper levels. The power doesn't seem to be there. And then in AAA, he completely went off, 12 home runs, 138 WRC plus, almost hit 300, recaptured the power. And at that point in time, our model was a little bit less able to distinguish those two things, one and the other. What we've tried to do to implement to help fix this, which Owen can elaborate more on in a second, is we've incorporated streaks and trends into our model to see, is this run something that's sticky, something that shows that this player is improving, or is it just the fortune of the game? And Owen can talk a little more about this right here.
Yeah. So, I mean, you can look out for we'll be releasing this for when the next season starts as part of our site. But I've been doing this research on streaks essentially, right? So looking at 25 game stretches and series of 25 game stretches as well, and being like, when does this mean something? When does it not? Because it's easy to get really excited if a guy goes off on a crazy stretch, but crazy stretches are not all built the same, right? If you're doing it and you're getting lucky on batted balls versus you're doing it and you're cranking tons of home runs and never striking out, those are two very different indications of something that's changed. So for a guy like Baldwin, our goal is that now we'll be able to better understand, okay, this is not only like the absolute value of his home run power, but the direction it's trending, and give a recency bias essentially for that, where we're understanding, okay, this has really improved, and the fact that it's improved is not a fluke, right? And those are the two key things to consider. And I think, Baldwin just shows, right? Like we're not, it's very hard to project prospects as well, right? Like we make no club. That's the reason we started with these percentages as well, is because we didn't want to be going up there and saying like, we know for sure that this guy is the next greatest thing on earth, or we know this guy has no shot, right? Like, things happen, things develop, and I think it's always important to keep that in mind. But obviously, we always want to be, get as many things right as possible.
Yeah, and I do think for Baldwin too, some of the people who kind of focus in on Braves prospects can remember or understand me talking about Baseball America's minor league park factors, and talking about how Mississippi, that AA ballpark that they had before they moved to Columbus for 2025, had one of some of the worst park factors for offense in the entire minor leagues.
Yes.
And I do think that's another reason Braves fans have asked in general why it feels like they have all of these prospects that come up and contend for Rookie of the Year, but the system's rated kind of low. And a lot of that's just quantity and things like that. But I think some of it too is, especially the offensive guys like Michael Harris and like Drake Baldwin, maybe don't produce the numbers a typical prospect of that skill would produce at that level, because those park factors were so extreme against home runs, against extra base hits, and all of that. So I do think that's really interesting as well. You talked about streaks. I've got a little off topic. I didn't prep you on this, but I want to ask about how we should view Arizona Fall League stats, because I know you guys have a pretty strong opinion on that. Braves fans saw Pat Plosy out there, saw Jim Jarvis, Luke Sennard. A lot of guys were excited about the Arizona Fall League, but I think we probably need to moderate that a little bit. We'll do that next, right here on Braves Today. Final segment of Braves Today. Lindsay Crosby joined by the fellas from Down on the Farm Substack, downonthefarm.substack.com. Definitely go subscribe. Absolutely worth it. It's made me a better amateur baseball analyst. So definitely go check it out. And when talking about streaks, we saw in the Arizona Fall League, a lot of these Braves players who have gone out there have been able to produce pretty well out in the desert. We know that offense is inflated in that environment. We see the same thing in the Pacific Coast League and AAA. Yep. But is there any correlation between a guy going to the desert and looking good in that 20 games, 21 games? It's close to the 25 game streak you mentioned. And any of that success carrying over, or is that really just it might be more mental than anything, because they can get confidence or they can show they're healthy after a struggling season?
Yeah.
So go ahead, Max.
I'll start here. I'll hand it off to Owen pretty quickly here. But honestly, the answer is like most things, it depends.
Yeah.
And one of the things that our model tends to highlight a little bit more than some others out there is the impact of age on kind of relativizing stats.
Yeah.
Right. And it's like that exactly in the AFL. Guys that are young who tear up the AFL, or guys that are young who do kind of okay in the AFL, that's a really positive sign.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and a lot of the time it correlates with a strong season. But to see more of that in the AFL is a big deal, especially because for guys that are at, you know, high A and below, these are some of the best pitchers that they've ever faced. Most of the guys that they're facing at that level are maybe talent-wise for sure less than them, but they are able to be pretty good because they're more mature. They're the 23, 24-year-old pitchers that are trying to carve out a career. But these guys are of their age and are stud pitchers, right? These are the guys with the elite stuff that could be major league stuff one day. So I think to see a guy succeed in that type of a situation is for sure positive, but it shows just the impact of age on our model. A lot of the guys who do well in the AFL, who tend not to project out well later, are that cookie cutter 24, 25-year-old player with a 27% strikeout rate and 15 home runs last season, right? There's so many of those guys who do well in the AFL, but that player type doesn't, you know, mature quite as well as a young guy who's making good contact.
Yeah. And I was just going to lead into that, Max, with saying, like, I think the importance of contextualizing statistics by league, like you said, Lindsay, is crucial, right? Because you have leagues where an 800 OPS is fantastic, and you have leagues where an 800 OPS is below average. So I think that when you're looking at this, you know, this was like the first thing that we realized when we started all this, is that if we're going to be talking about players, we got to talk about them in terms of relative stats, right, rather than those overall stats. And so that's what goes into our model and what we show on those visualizations that you were talking about earlier, because, you know, the raw numbers alone in the minor leagues can be just so misleading.
And if you're a young player in the AFL, this is something that was mind blowing to me. In the full season, the most recent full season that we had when we wrote our article was 2024. The average OPS in high A was 689. The average, so if you were a high A player, right, you put up a 689 OPS, you're like, that's not great. It's probably going to get you around OPS, you know, 100 WRC plus.
Yeah.
In the AFL that season, 806.
Yeah, there you go.
Contextualizing per league.
Crazy. Yeah. That's two completely different levels of baseball, right? And so that I think for the fan who's not just absurdly engaged deeply in minor league stuff, that's the number one takeaway I would say, is that this AFL is a juiced offensive environment, and you see guys putting up an 800 OPS. Everybody's putting up an 800 OPS. So, you know, it's good, but it's not that special.
Yeah, it's important to understand, to your point, what the expectation should be based on the average level of performance there, and kind of seeing some of that. I know you guys kind of have talked about the guy to watch being John Gil. Is there anybody else in the Braves system that your model thinks is a little bit underrated versus the public perception of them that you want to highlight in the last few minutes of the show?
Yeah, I could talk about Owen Carey, not just because we share a name on that front. He's not a guy that I'd put in, like, he's not in our top 100 or anything, but he's a guy that I think Bear is paying some attention to.
That's who I was thinking about, actually, when you.
Oh, nice. Okay. All right. Yeah. Good. So, last year he was in single A, and he held his own there, right? He put up a 102 WRC plus, which, obviously not going to overwhelm anybody, but he was young, right? 18 in single A. You're playing against guys that are on average about like 3 years older than you. So to be able to do that and hold your own is really impressive. And the model, again, kind of like with Gil, likes the fact that he's got a pretty low strikeout rate as an over-leveled player. So we had him at a K rate of about 1.2 standard deviations better than average. So quite a bit above average, essentially. The problem, though, is that while he does sometimes play center field, he's spending a lot of time in the corner outfields, right? And if that's happening when he's 18 in single A, it's a pretty good bet that by the time he gets to the major leagues, he's not going to be a true center fielder. He's going to be stuck in one of the corners, and that puts a lot more pressure on the bat. So I'd say for him, the bottom line is, like, if he gets some power to show up to go along with that good hit tool, this is a guy that could be a really productive major league player. But the pressure for that to happen is a lot higher than for a guy like Gil, where the defense can carry him more because he's playing that up the middle position, which projects defensive value for him. Whereas Carey, we like the hit tool, but he's got to prove a lot more at the plate because he doesn't have that kind of defensive floor there.
That was the very next question I was going to ask, was about at what point does it become concerning when you start sharing time? And it feels like to me, the organizations that like to have everybody cross-train, you can almost learn more, like Tampa Bay, for instance. They like to have everybody play a lot of different things. It almost feels like you can learn more by who they choose to not cross-train. Like Carson Williams essentially never came off a shortstop, while everybody else was playing second, third, short, because he was so gifted. Am I just is that does that still hold as far as there's cross-training and there's moving guys off for defensive reasons, and it's important, again, context, to know maybe how that organization likes to operate? Is that something that you kind of struggled with from the outside, trying to figure that out for all 30 teams?
Yeah, I think something for us, we haven't focused a ton on that type of cross-training, but in a way we have, because a lot of that cross-training happens at those upper levels, right? You get sophisticated enough where the major league debut is upon you, the team sees you and wants you to get plate appearances,
and that's when they add it.
And that's when they do it, right? If you're a good shortstop, but the team has a good shortstop, now they're going to give you some time at second. It's not because you're bad. You might even be a better positional shortstop than the guy who's playing shortstop, but they see, okay, if this person can also play second and is immediately comfortable with it, that'll give our major league team a big boost, because ultimately, really, winning only matters at the top level. They can let you learn and let you hurt the team in AAA and AA without any problems. But as Owen said before, when that happens in AA and lower, that tends to point more in we've given up hope that you're going to be a good center fielder or a good shortstop. And for guys where that happens to them at a young age, they almost never end up being positive contributors. Out of the guys that were the top shortstops in the league in Major League Baseball, and for a large portion of positive defensive contributors in the infield, nearly all of them played shortstop in the minor leagues. You had some big-bodied third basemen who could move around, who had some arm issues. Like Brian Hayes was always a third baseman, and Paul DeYoung was a guy who discovered how to field really late in the game, which is extraordinarily rare. But other than that, if you get given up on at those low levels, that's not good.
Well, you can still be a positive contributor, just to be clear, right? But it comes from the bat. You're unlikely to be a positive defensive contributor.
Yeah, the glove.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And I guess I never really thought about the timing of when that cross training would start. I do think the Rays are kind of an extreme example. A lot of what the Rays do is kind of extreme, like having catcher set up down the middle for everything and things like that. Okay, that was some good insight. Thank you, Max. Where can Braves fans go to get more of your content, your info, subscribe, and support you guys in what you do?
Absolutely. So we do our work two main places. We have, as you've highlighted before, the Down on the Farm Substack. That's where we publish our weekly articles on prospects, research topics like the AFL and balls and strikes and what traits matter in development. And we're excited this year. We're going to expand our offerings to our paid subscribers, find ways to follow those streaks that Owen talked about earlier, add some daily ways to follow your highlight players daily. So if you're a Braves fan, you can go on, select your Braves prospects and see how they're doing. So Down on the Farm Substack, and also follow us on Twitter and Blue Sky. We're Down on the Farm 12.
That'll do it for the Tuesday episode of Braves Today. Do us a favor, like the video, please subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Braves Today.